Associates. I'm Cheyenne Charvetka-Church, and I'm the co-director of the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy Program. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Diana Chigas, and Sekulani Famodi, the country director of Accountability Lab South Africa. We are delighted to be here and have the opportunity to talk through our newest framework that explores how ignoring corruption can undermine development and peace-building results and go on to exacerbate fragility and conflict. Now, this is a work in progress, and the thinking comes out of the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy Program's work on the intersection between peace-building and anti-corruption, which is just one aspect of the programming that we have, looking at how we can increase the effectiveness of anti-corruption work in context of endemic corruption. Before we dive in, we'd really like to get a better sense about who's joined us. I see some of you have put in some greetings into the chat. And if you can just take a second, introduce yourself, maybe your name, your organization, where you're from, whatever you think would be good for us to know. It'd be great to see who's with us this morning. Hi, Martha. Oh, we've got more from South Africa, Sekulani, and Morocco. Fantastic. Armando, thanks for joining us. Peter and Atik, thank you. Glad to see you. Camila from Colombia, excellent. Your morning, like me, I'm in Canada. African Union, afternoon to you. We also then want to find out a little bit more about people's background. Patricia, if you could put up our poll, please. This will be a quick poll that'll appear in front of you in theory. Just say hi to Brooke, Michael, and Ruth. Thanks for joining us. Basma, Lebanon, thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon. Appreciate it. Now we have just a few more. We've 3/4 of folks have participated in our poll. We'll just give it one more second. And all right, we're going to end that. And Pratush, can you please show the result? Oh, I can do that. I'll show it. So we have an interesting group, diverse backgrounds. We've got folks in the development field, a handful of peace builders and anti-corruption, and then we've got some other, which is interesting, probably meaning that they cross-sect, but in general, a really interesting, diverse group. I'll just shut that down. Pratush, could you share the slides, please? And if you can go to the second one. Perfect. So we're going to get started. I want to say a little bit more about the context that we're referencing. The context for which we have developed this framework experienced both endemic corruption, which is where corruption is the way things are done. It's not the aberration. It's absolutely normal. And they also experience fragility or conflict. And of course, there's a relationship between these two, as all aspects of fragility are exacerbated by this corruption, which means that these contexts are highly complex and that there's no real way for a program of any type to tippy-toe around the corruption. These contexts also mean traditional forms of anti-corruption will rarely be sufficient to make a difference. So that means programming based on an understanding of corruption as a classic principal agent problem, such as increasing transparency or heightening sanctioning, will rarely be enough. Next slide, please. So with context of endemic corruption and fragility in mind, the framework we want to talk about today lays out 3 different things. First, how you can't work in these areas without engaging with corruption. And we've identified 4 common ways we see that corruption undermines results in development and peace-building programs. So that means whether it's a Watsan, health, civil service reform, or a dialogue or national reconciliation program, corruption can, in these contexts, undermine your results. Of the 4 ways that we see this, there are 2 internal to the program and 2 that are external to the program. And we're going to walk into all 4 of these. Next slide, please. Now, when we say that we've undermined results, what we've opted to use the OECD DAC evaluation criteria, impact, sustainability, efficiency, effectiveness, and relevance, in order to tease out the various aspects of results. And I know there's a 6th criteria, coherence, but we're still thinking about exactly where and how that plays out. So the second thing that we want to walk through today is that the framework explains how this corruption not only undermines these results, but how those can go on to exacerbate fragility and corruption. And finally, the only way to know how corruption will impact our work and then develop useful mitigating measures is to do quality analysis. And this entails exploring why the situation is, not simply describing it. It also gives in this analysis primacy to the role of power, politics, and we would argue the social dynamics, such as social norms, that drive many corrupt practices. As I said at the beginning, the framework is a work in progress. So we've structured our time so we'll have several junctures where we welcome your questions, comments, examples. Diana will kick off the conversations talking about corruption in the external environment and the implications for programming, and then we'll pause for questions. Sekalani will then talk us through an example of where corruption was a significant hindrance to a development objective, namely how corruption undermines fire safety in Johannesburg. And we'll have time for questions for him as well. And then I'll talk about the more internal portion of the framework, followed by an open conversation or discussion time. Now, for questions, we have the Q&A function. So if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will also keep the chat open, and you can put in whatever you want in the chat, but we won't be trying to pull questions from the chat. If you'd like to ask your question live, simply put the word live next to your name in the Q&A function, and we'll call on you and bring you live into the conversation, okay? So if you want to ask, just write live next to your name in the Q&A function. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Diana to get us started.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I'm going to talk about the external, the sort of corruption external to the program, the 2 ways that we're finding that inattention to corruption undercuts success and exacerbates fragility and conflict. And let me first talk about the strategic level. And Prajesh, could you, next slide, please? And here we're talking about how the failure to address corruption and its role in conflict and fragility can undermine the viability and effectiveness of development, peace building, governance, civil service reform, et cetera, strategies. In other words, it makes it difficult for these strategies to promote change and advance the development, peace building, or governance agendas. And it's a note here that this is more than just about mainstreaming anti-corruption in programs, though that is also a good idea and may be part of a robust strategy. We think a lot of good projects can do a lot of good, but won't necessarily add up to positive effects on the broader goal. So this is more about analyzing and addressing corruption in the formulation of strategies, whether at the country level, regional, thematic, sectoral, et cetera, in a coherent fashion. You know, for example, a strategy to promote the rule of law in a country without understanding and addressing the reasons the judiciary is not independent or taking account of the forces that would resist greater independence and the function of corruption in them, it would be difficult to formulate an effective strategy. Or a peace building strategy, and this is the field that Cheyenne and I come from, that doesn't address corruption when it's a driver of inequitable distribution of resources among conflicting groups, or a driver of land disputes that result from favoritism or corrupt allocation. It would be hard to make progress in reducing tensions when those sources of tensions and the enabler of the behavior that creates those tensions is not addressed. This may seem relatively obvious to most of you in the audience. Many of you are anti-corruption practitioners, you're development practitioners, you're here because you believe that addressing anti-corruption is important. But what we have seen in the field is that we've actually seen a tremendous lack of attention to corruption in these strategies. An analysis we did looking at criminal justice sector reform in Central African Republic several years ago. We looked at all the programs and there was very little attention to corruption in justice reform strategies and the resulting programs. And this was despite the fact that the judiciary was subject to political influence and influence from armed groups, despite the fact that corruption in the justice sector was a source of discrimination against Muslims, and the fact that Muslims bribing judges out of fear of what would happen to them in the justice sector reinforced stereotypes of Muslims as corrupt and increased tensions. Similarly, Transparency International's research on security sector reform in West Africa also found that mitigation of corrupt practices just doesn't receive a lot of attention in SSR strategies. It's marginalized in the frameworks that they use. And there are several good reasons, or a number of good reasons for not dealing with corruption, particularly in these environments. A key one I think you will probably relate to is the fear of consequences of taking on corruption directly. Anti-corruption can be destabilizing. It can engender resistance by powerful interests effective and sort of undermine any reforms that you're undertaking. And in fragile and conflict-affected environments, corruption can be a stabilizing factor, at least in the short term, accommodating what some people call malign actors. And accepting and tolerating corruption is often felt to be necessary because one has to accommodate the balance of power in the war at the time in order to end large-scale fighting in the war. And so access to corruption opportunities through power sharing or divvying up opportunities for rents may be essential to getting a peace deal or a political settlement that ends large-scale violence. I've worked in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in some places we've seen this many times. So there's a fear of destabilizing political settlement and destabilizing a peace that would lead people to be reluctant to address corruption. But as you can see here, there are some negative results. One is that a lot of the programs will then lack strategic relevance. In other words, the strategies may not be focused on key issues or drivers or not fit for the context. And by extension, they won't have the desired impacts or be able to sustain the impacts that they have. Hard to make significant progress if you don't address the drivers or ignore the countervailing forces. Think about an example in South Sudan where post-independent aid strategies focused on institution building, but failed to take account of the fact, as some say, that corruption is the system of governance there, and a political marketplace, to use Alex DeWall's terms, is neo-patrimonial, highly militarized, a kleptocracy, based on monetized transactional politics. So what happens is efforts then to build institutions were undermined and diverted to factional advantage and private gain. DDR, SSR was failure. In fact, there was an expansion of military. Health and other indicators did not improve despite significant investment. And so although there were bubbles of reform, when the resources were available and there was stability when there was resources were available. If the situation changed, more reform didn't happen and they were unable to constrain violence. A second sort of result has to do with conflict and fragility consequences. And interventions may exacerbate and entrench violence or make it difficult to move from what we call a negative peace with the sort of cessation of large-scale violence into a more positive or developmental peace and good governance. So stability may be achieved in the short term by turning a blind eye to or facilitating bargains that integrate these malign actors and sort of allow a division of access to rents and through corruption. But in the longer term, the results may not be so positive. First, the end of war doesn't necessarily mean the end of violence. So if corruption isn't addressed, it can help entrench a political settlement in which violence is actually embedded. So there's continued violence, human rights violations by unreformed police and military who have a stake in the system and in corruption. Or it may be permitted with criminal groups being able to conduct violence. And from the perspective of citizens, the sense of insecurity may not be significantly different. Also, in the long term, where stability may be achieved, postponing dealing with corruption and just assuming we can deal with it later can contribute to entrenching the system of corruption, sort of to elite capture, systems of corruption and entrenching actors that then make it difficult when one gets around to thinking about corruption, makes it difficult later to then make further progress and address the drivers. And again, this is all at the expense of citizens, as well as being able to recreate exclusion that contains the seeds of future conflict over the long term. I think this doesn't mean that corruption needs to be addressed immediately and directly. We're not saying that. It is often inappropriate to push for big sensitive reforms in these contexts, especially immediately. And there are definitely trade-offs that need to be made in the short term. But we do think that we need to be thinking about a strategy over time for helping to create the conditions that shift those corrupt systems that drive the problems we want to address, how and when in a pretty nonlinear way we'll get there, and think about how external interventions and our interventions may exacerbate or reduce the degree to which we contribute to entrenching some of these systems and making it difficult later on. So as Cheyenne suggested, we do think now the first step is really to engage in analysis. Every context will be very different. And it's the only way to know how corruption and that corruption conflict interaction will impact our work and how our work will impact it. And here we found it fairly helpful to do a systems-based analysis of corruption, what kind and how it impacts the problem, including conflict and fragility, and integrate it with the conflict analysis, understand who the key actors are, and who the elites are, their motivations, sources, the levels and pathways they have to power, their interests and goals, and then look at also the drivers of the situation. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Pratyush. Sorry, the next slide then. You see here, this is from a conflict analysis and evaluation of conflict prevention in Ghana. And I'm not going to go into the systems map because Sekwedlane done that, but you can see the two areas that are circled in orange have to do with sort of where corruption fits into the conflict dynamics. And you can see some of these systems analyses really allow you to see some of the ripple effects of corruption on some of the phenomena, but also really work through how corruption will make it really difficult to address some of these other things like politicization or polarization or interethnic tensions, et cetera. If you could go to the previous slide. So that's the strategic level. At the second sort of way in which corruption in the environment might, and not addressing corruption dynamics in the environment can undermine success, is at a sort of more micro level and looking at project outcomes. And it is a similar dynamic except at a micro scale. So any program being, if it's education, COVID-19 health response, peace building, development in a context of endemic corruption needs to be asking how might corruption block our ability to achieve results? And when we can in an analysis identify that it does, what are the response strategies that we need to have in order to build them into our theory of change so that we can overcome some of those blockages. And again, this is not about figuring out how corruption wastes or manipulates use of resources in the program. It's about ignoring corruption in the environment that may impact the quality and plausibility of the theory of change for our program, and therefore diminish its effectiveness. Sort of a brief example, from just a fictional one, but one that we've seen in many places. Imagine one of the few operating hospitals in part of the country that has a very high maternal death rate during childbirth, much higher than the national average and in other areas. So an NGO goes in and is working with the hospitals, the main health centers that serve a large part of this area to improve essential maternal and newborn health care in hospitals and improve the quality of health services. The program will include training of maternity ward nursing staff in early identification of problems, improved case file management, upgrading of equipment, et cetera, staffing. But the program doesn't include any any aspect to tackle the illicit sale, sort of theft and sale of drugs from the hospital, or the fact that fees are demanded by doctors in the hospitals for people entering to get services. It was felt that this was too sensitive and would deter the hospital leadership from agreeing to actually do the work. And so during the program, you see a marginal improvement in the key statistics. So there's some progress, but a recognition also that real sustained improvements in the outcomes desired would not be possible without access to appropriate medications. So one would have to deal with that over the longer term. So it affects effectiveness, and there are downstream implications on conflict and fragility as well. First, the corruption within these services may exacerbate inequalities. This may further marginalize women and further marginalize people in this area who are already marginalized, either because they don't receive access to services or because they can't afford to pay these kinds of fee for service. And it also reinforces that pay to play, and so to speak, is the rule of the game. So corruption then breeds more corruption and also then undermines the sort of legitimacy and trust in the government as well as international actors. So again, coming back to that, what kind of analysis would you need to do? And again, I'm going to turn to Swetlana after some questions here, because I think he will have a much more rich example about how we've gone about it. But need to sort of think about how corruption fits into and affects the problem. And so determine the degree to which corruption is contributing to the problem, and therefore whether you need to integrate it into programming, because you may not. It's not always the case that one has to address corruption. And also why the problem is happening. What are the power, the political, the social dynamics that are affecting the problem? And I will end there for the time being, and turn for a few question and answer, which I think Cheyenne will moderate. And again, as she said, if you have a question, please pop it into the Q&A. And if you want to ask it live, write live, and we'll show you on the screen. Yeah, and Practitioner, if you can stop the slide share for a second, that would be great.
So we'll just pause there to see if we have any questions specifically on what Diana has presented. There anything that we'd want to clarify, or should we just move straight into Swetlana's example of that last way in which corruption can undermine program outcomes? Pratush, can you please give
Sarah Dix has a live, wants to ask a live question.
I was just saying that. Sarah, once you're unmuted and Pratush has helped you appear on the screen, go ahead.
We're having a hard time getting Sarah, and then we have two people with their hands up, I guess, too. There's Sarah.
Thank you very much. That was a bit of a slow time lag with the Beirut internet and power situation. Sorry. I've had the pleasure to read some of the work that one of your associates, Rosemary Ventura, did in the literature review for this study. And I've been thinking since then, connecting to what you just said, to what extent is your work analyzing from a program lens? You mentioned both that this is something that national governments could be examining, but also you're speaking to an audience of practitioners. So I'm wondering to what extent you're thinking programmatically, because what you're touching on, much of it is really bigger than any program.
Yeah, I agree, and I invite sort of Swetlana and Cheyenne to answer. My sense is that certainly the second way, sort of the program outcomes, is a way one can address it at the program level, and recognizing, and sort of as a peace building practitioner, this is what I spent a decade doing, is really thinking that, you know, if you get a lot of really good programs that have done it, there are, as you said, larger factors involved. So one is to really think about it at a strategic level, but also to think about programs, how they might connect to other efforts at different levels and fit into a bigger strategy, even if a bigger strategy hasn't been sort of fully designed. But knowing that, for example, you're working at a local level and corruption at the national government level is really undermining the local level, how do you then think about connecting to that level? And Sequelani, I think you can probably speak to that a lot more because you've been thinking about that a lot.
Sure. Thank you, Diana. Yes, I think the principle of firstly identifying where it is that you would like to intervene and how, given your particular strengths and unique positioning within the context, and how that fits in with other efforts beyond just perhaps yourself, is really useful. In South Africa, I think there's a really great example in that with the National Anti-Corruption strategy that has just been developed. The strategy was to respond to what is commonly known as the 9 wasted years, where runaway corruption really characterized the way in which governance was being done from a national level all the way down to the local level, where the tie hits the tar as far as where people experience public services is concerned. And the underlying principle for the National Anti-Corruption Strategy was that firstly, it had to be a whole of society approach, and civil society really pushed hard to have that kind of approach rather than have a government-driven process just by itself, because of the breakdown in the legitimacy of government at that period and continuing even today. And so the whole of society approach really looks at ways in which various stakeholders from government as the perhaps conveners of the strategy, together with civil society and the private sector, could collaborate and collaborate on their efforts and align their efforts around how to respond to very specific corruption problems and enablers in the country, so that we might be able then to bring society along with us in those interventions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sekolani. Great question, Sarah. Thank you for that. And I agree, the first angle, the first part of Diana's presentation does reference fairly macro, big picture thinking and responses. But our sense is that every project should have an understanding of how it's contributing to the bigger picture, so that we are actually trying to shift the ecosystem of whatever you're working on, be it poverty, development, good governance. So it's yes, and we think it's relevant to programmers. I wanted to jump to another question in the Q&A. Yana asked a great one. So Diana, what kind of organizational structures should be in place to perform the project ex ante analysis in terms of possible corruption? So what should be in place?
I think there are sort of structures in terms of the project cycle, which make it difficult. Actually being able to do analysis is helpful. So taking the time, but having a structure in place to think about sort of both the problem, and many of you do a needs analysis, but also do a causal analysis and thinking about how corruption can be brought in there. So you may sometimes, some people draw on some expertise. What we found too, that doing opportunities for joint analysis around the problems, different organizations, sometimes it's very difficult for one organization to build the capacity because you have to know something about corruption, something about the problem, but doing joint analysis may be helpful, and also helps on the question that Sarah just asked of really thinking, how can we think a little bit bigger and dealing with some of the bigger issues together.
Super, thanks, Diana. And I want to jump to Precious with a live question. So Patricia, if you can make Precious a panelist so that she can ask her question in person.
Apologies, I was not ready to be appearing. I had to do some adjustments. I think mainly I'm looking for where can we go to get support and help, and also get the tools to deal with it. I have been in public sector audit committees for the past 15 years. What I've seen, you have no idea. And also recently appointed with NLC, which is a national lottery in South Africa, that does a lot of grants, and in there, there's been billions when you look at over the years. So I am looking for places to get the tools, but also work with auditing fraternity, because by profession, I'm a registered auditor and a chartered accountant. I see how we have missed things as auditors, whether it's internal audit or external audit, because even with Gupta reports of what we're getting, you saw how Gupta actually, they changed records and stuff. I think as the audit fraternity itself, we have not been proactive in finding and working with tools, and also collaborate also with other countries in rooting out corruption in our country. Apologies for taking long, so, but yeah.
And Sequetlani, I wonder if you want to take a first stab at that.
Yeah, you know, I think, and I'll perhaps speak a little bit to this as I make my more formal interventions. But I think that the significant thing to do first here is to really understand that corruption and the systems or various technologies in which corrupt systems use in order to take over or capture particularly public institutions, as in the case of South Africa, are not simply effectively responded to by enacting policy or having or changing out the boards, as is wont to happen, particularly in the South African context. It's also really about understanding how does the corruption system and the corruption cycle affect the particular institution. So really understanding the institution in context, understanding the problem itself in context as a start. And then from there, not only bringing in policy interventions or changing in and changing out in a revolving door kind of syndrome leadership in those structures, but really bringing in the leadership as well as the supporting frameworks, mechanisms, and relationships, particularly relationships, into the system so that it can bring the whole institution along in bringing about that change. Because more often than not, you will find that there are particular elements within the system itself, within the particular institution itself, that are also adding to the dynamic of corruption, whether directly or indirectly, as well as other elements which are doing the very most to obstruct the systems and dynamics of corruption as they occur inside of the institution. Thank you.
And I just add, and I think Sequetlani has sort of gotten it on the nose, but I also recognizing that in that we found the systems mapping to be helpful for that, but also recognize that people, coming back to the organizational structure, there's a conflict analysis and gender analysis and this analysis and corruption analysis. There are so many tools that it's sometimes very hard to absorb. I was just looking at the list of things that you need to know. And so one of the things that we are grappling with now is try to figure out how can we start to integrate these a bit more into something more simple that sort of catches some of the complexity without doing it in enormous detail that overwhelms organizations. And I have to say we're not there yet and would love to continue that conversation because that's something we aim to do.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Precious. And I want to switch gears. We know there's more questions. We'll answer some in written form if we can, but we'll also have more time for questions after Sequetlani, who is going to give us a case example from South Africa of one of the external dynamics that Diana had discussed.
Great, thank you so much, Cheyenne. So let me maybe just start with, where we start. So at Accountability Lab, we run an annual campaign called Integrity Icon. And this is a campaign to name and fame rank and file public service heroes who embody the values of integrity, accountability, and service excellence in the delivery of public goods and services. Really, you know, this is really about saying who's modeling excellence, the kind of excellence in the public service that we want to see more of as we, particularly in South Africa, rebuild our public service, rebuild and renew trust in our public service. So in 2018, two extraordinary firefighters, Dion Esso and Jocelyn Flank, these are the two gentlemen that you see at the center of the screen, were among the public servants who were nominated in the campaign and ultimately named the People's Choice winners for the impact they were making in the city of Johannesburg, where they work and where I live, particularly in the area of youth development. So significantly, in 2018, when they were nominated and named as integrity icons, we used to call the campaign integrity idols then, a devastating fire had broken out in a government-owned high-rise building, which killed 3 firefighters, injured several others, and significantly put in full view how ill-equipped the city of Johannesburg was in preventing and responding to fires. Now, the fire prevention response services is a core competency of the municipal authority. Now, because Integrity Icon is more than an awards show, it's really important just to underscore that. A key feature of our work through the campaign is to also mobilize public support interventions for public servants on the front lines who are at the receiving end of the public's frustrations about the impact of austerity policies, ineffectual management, and corruption on their ability to access public goods and services. You know, in South Africa, we live in the most unequal society in the world with some of the highest unemployment rates. So an overwhelming majority of people are living in poverty and have no other option but to have their most basic needs met by the public service, and rightly so. Otherwise, I mean, what do governments exist for? And so we really wanted to know from these firefighters, as well as others, what initiatives or interventions could be brought about to make their job easier. And their response was really pretty straightforward. You know, they said they really just wanted to know that they were safe, supported, and enabled to do their jobs through access to 3 basic things. The first, more fit for purpose fire trucks to be able to get larger teams to major fires quickly. Now, at the time, the active fire engine count in the city of Johannesburg, and this is a massive city, ranged somewhere between 4 and 6 fire trucks that were operable at any given time. The second that they required was the appropriate equipment to enable them to improve their safety, given the kinds of risks they were increasingly called to take in light of the kinds of fires that were breaking out in the city. And this was for a variety of reasons that we'll also see in the systems map that I will blow up for you presently. But mainly it's things like the urban sprawl as a result of the rural urban migration dynamics in the country, as well as apartheid, the impact of apartheid spatial planning, the fact that people were living in more and more informality, particularly at the periphery of the city, which meant that formal services and formal access to infrastructure that enabled services like the fire service to reach them were pretty weak. And then, of course, issues just around the resourcing of the fire safety and response services. And then the third key thing that they needed was more tactical response training to build a capacity and confidence to face the kinds of major fires that the city was seeing more and more of, for some of the reasons, for the reasons I've just mentioned and more. If we can move over to the next slide, please. Great. And so in order to respond, or at least to frame an intervention that we could bring or coordinate to respond to their ask, we would want to do this through a positive deviance kind of approach or perspective, which is really how we like to do things at Accountability Lab, really thinking about what exists that is working well and how then do we build upon that. But to do this, we had to educate ourselves a little more about the context in which firefighters, like our integrity icons, were working within. You know, I mean, what do we know about the business of firefighting except that we need it? So we really need to dig deep a little. So when we started to mine the literature and ask the questions, the question, why is the city of Johannesburg why is the city of Johannesburg's fire response capacity, which was once among the leading services in Africa, in such decline? We were hoping that the story would be a simple one. Resources weren't weren't arriving where they needed to. They simply needed to be released in order to be able to pay for the much needed training, equipment, and fire engines that would bring an otherwise well-functioning department and supporting administration back to standard. Simple, right? But boy, were we wrong. Allegations of corruption maladministration and the hollowing out of skilled and experienced capacity in various areas of the City of Johannesburg administration started to emerge and coalesced into a story of how giving firefighters what they needed to feel safe, supported, and enabled to do their high risk and sometimes lethal jobs demanded that we pay attention to how various forms and effects of corruption, which include the mere perception of corruption and corrupt systems within institutions, were keeping the system from functioning as it was expected to in order to do what it needed to. Now on the screen there, you can see just some of the headlines that I've extracted and an image of the context in which we are speaking to. You know, so more and more fires are emerging as a result of informality. We're seeing things like the infrastructure itself going into fire. If you see that the headline around an underground tunnel going on fire, this was being the second time that this has happened. Issues around how corruption itself was a key hindrance to providing the fire engines, the much needed fire engines that the city requires. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So when we blew up what the literature was telling us into into a system map generated through the system-based analysis that would support our understanding of the problem, so we could frame an appropriate intervention that could itself then be well supported by the system and its context, we learned several key lessons. Or perhaps even before we get to the key lessons, I think let's just look at the map itself. So if you look on the far left, the area in blue, in the deep blue, you know, you can see really what we were trying to engage with most directly. And this had to do with the degree to which firefighters were feeling supported and motivated to do their work. And this was directly linked to the fact that they needed the equipment, they needed the engines, and they needed the training. But as we look further through the systems map, we start to see that there were other kinds of issues at key points in the institutional setup and the system that brought the resources that could bring the resources to firefighters in order to support the degree to which they felt supported and motivated, and thereby improve preparedness. We start to see that these things started to shape that whole system. These things included things like the degree and effectiveness of stakeholder participation, support, and advocacy for fire services. So if there are no external parties to the system who are supportive of the people within the system who are delivering the services, it really does impact on people's sense of, or frontliners' sense of preparedness, frontliners' sense of supportedness. If we look at things like allocation of funding, for instance, we know that support from the outside is a key ingredient in motivating for better funding, better resourcing through various formal procedures like the IDP process, and this is the integrated development planning process of the country. But of course, it's also about the external measures or informal measures that are brought about, such as advocacy and so forth. But when we look even further along the system, because we were asking questions around, well, you know, is it just enough that there are people on the inside and the outside motivating for more resources, or is there more to the problem? We started to learn that actually there were also issues just around the formal procedures by which the resourcing moves to the fire department in order for it to be able to receive the support that it requires in order to be able to give the quality service. This included things like how the procurement process is vulnerable or available to capture, elite capture, political capture, which is itself linked to dynamics of corruption and political patronage, often as we have seen in the context that is South Africa. We also learn that these kinds of behaviors then erode accountability, and the erosion of accountability then starts to impact on things like the ability of people to feel safe and supported and enabled to start to obstruct and resist the cycle of corruption. And so we start to see the gutting of key people in the system who have the experience, who have the key relationships, from being able to do the work that they can do to try and maintain the strength of the system in order to be able to resource and strengthen what we are really most concerned about, which is the preparedness of the fire service, right? So we also see various other things like the dominance of political party benefit, focused agendas, which then capture how the institution itself ought to operate, capturing procurement and so forth. We see issues around cadre deployment and elite capture through the capture of the personnel function itself, and various other dynamics. And so it became very clear for us that we had to do a little bit more than just try and lobby for more resources in order to bring in equipment, engines, and training, but rather had to also engage more directly the systems, the issues around elite capture of the procurement function, elite capture of the personnel function, and then also, in addition to that, target our intervention. And you'll see there in the center between all the action that's happening on the left, which is dominantly blue, and the action that's happening on the right, which is dominantly red, targeting the willingness and or ability of municipal authorities to detect, prevent, and correct irregularities. Because ultimately, that is where the core function of anti-corruption work is most concerned. By doing that, we directly as well as indirectly support the resourcing of our firefighters or support the success of the intervention that we are directly targeting through our own work where we are at. And so what did we learn? And I think there are key 3 lessons here. I think the first lesson was what appeared to be a simple issue of occupational health and safety has a lot more to do with corruption and administrative capacity than what we'd expected. And I think this will count for anyone who employs the systems-based analysis approach to designing their intervention in fragile contexts. The values, social norms, and behaviors of people who appear to be far removed from the site of the problem. And so I'm talking here a little bit about, or I'm signaling here a little about, you know, the folks in the administration of the city who are quite far removed from where the fire department are, have the greatest and most direct impact on the people. These are the frontliners and citizens, firefighters, and those of us who depend on their services at the site of the problem. So we have to connect the dots here. We can't escape it. The second lesson was that without understanding how corruption and ineffectual administration affects the discrete problem you're wanting to address and its impact on the intervention that you're wanting to introduce, we're probably going to end up only spending a lot of effort and resources to get not very far. And a great example of this was what happened when we were developing or triangulating an intervention based on not having yet done the systems analysis. Our thinking was simply that, you know, if we got more people engaged around the issue of the experience of firefighters, get more public information out there and readily available, something would and could happen. But that wasn't in fact the case. In fact, the systems analysis, the systems-based analysis enabled us to understand that our intervention really had to target also the willingness and or ability of municipal authorities to detect, prevent, and correct irregularities, so that the opening up of public information could be met by people inside of the system in order to be to develop a virtuous cycle or mutually reinforcing system that supports our intervention, the interventions that we would like, in order to be able to build and renew the kind of fire service that we desire and deserve in the city of Johannesburg. The third lesson that we learned was that whatever the intervention or point of entry that you would like to take in bringing your intervention about, it has to be directly linked and supported by people inside the system who share your commitment to making that system work. in part, this is the work that we're trying to do through the Integrity Icon campaign, really shining the light on the people who are in the system because of our implicit understanding that public institutions are composed of people. People and relationships is what make government institutions and any other kind of institution for that matter really work. And so we really have to lean into the value that they bring. And more than that, whatever we do on the outside may only add more pressure or more annoyance to what's happening on the inside because of perhaps a lack of understanding or a limited understanding of the particular institutional dynamics that are operating within these institutions, where people are doing a lot of work in terms of setting up guardrails in really risky environments, risky for their jobs, risky for their lives. And by working with them and supporting them and understanding or leaning into their knowledge, we are then able then to really build a well-targeted intervention that has the internal support in order to be able to do what we need and want the intervention to do. So thank you.
Sekulani, that was super. I'm conscious of time, so what I'm going to suggest is I'm going to say 2 minutes on the internal dynamics, and then for those who can still stay, I know that people will have questions for Sekulani, but we'll stay and we'll go a bit long because I'm aware that we had said we'd close on the hour, but we did start a bit late. So Pratyusha, if you could put the slides back up, I'm going to say just a very brief, just to wrap it up, because we said we would also talk about the internal dynamics and then go back to questions. Diana laid out for us the ways that corruption in the external environment can undermine our project results. And she talked about preventing strategic progress and undermining project outcomes. But we also know that corruption in endemic contexts can also undermine results through internal dynamics. The most obvious way corruption undermines a project is through the diversion of material resources. And in short, this is the theft of money and stuff by people within the implementing or subcontracting team. And I'll ask Pratyusha to go to the next slide. This sort of leakage obviously impacts programmatic efficiency. So if you have less funds to use, or family members of staff are using vehicles for their personal needs, or equipment is stolen, there's less that can be done in the program. And if you have less that can be done in the program, not only impacts efficiency issues, it also impacts effectiveness. But it can also connect to corruption and fragility as well, because this leakage can play into what drives fragility. Go back, thank you. Yeah, we're on number 3. So for instance, diversion of resources for personal gain can delegitimize the aid sector itself, because citizens start to view aid as another resource stream that people tap for personal gain, rather than a purpose or a social driven sector. We saw this dynamic really clearly in our work in northern Uganda, where staff stealing from aid agencies was not considered wrong or shameful or inappropriate, because these agencies and their programs were seen as illegitimate themselves. When we add a conflict lens to the diversion of resources, we believe resources can be diverted to support conflict parties. It can be as obvious or direct as militias using the resources to buy weapons, using stolen vehicles, but it can also be in terms of supporting families so breadwinners can go and fight. I had a lot more to say on that, but I'm giving you the abridged version. With regards to where we suggest practitioners start to get ahead of this risk is what we call a corruption risk plus. A corruption risk assessment plus. Here, it's not only if you map out the potential risks internal to the program, but we also have to understand why they would come about. This is just so important, because if we attempt to stop the risks, you will typically be dealing with what enables corruption, things like sloppy processes or limited oversight, and not what is causing the corruption, like social pressures that exert influence on people to comply with corrupt practices. Think of it this way. If we only look at the enablers, we are just working to shut the doors that people walk through. And pretty quickly, people will figure out how to open a window to continue what they were doing beforehand. Next slide, please. Staying internal to the program, the second way that corruption can undermine your programming is when program decision makers distort the program implementation for personal gain. And here it's around decisions around who to hire, which organizations to partner with, what vendor to select, which communities to include in a program, who should be on a participant list, and I can go on and on. You'll note these types of distortions tend to not be purely financial, but more in terms of favoritism or nepotism, conflict of interest, that type of thing. As for the consequences of this, clearly, if you aren't working with the right target population or haven't selected a skilled partner or a competent staff person, this is going to have negative effects on your relevance, and it's going to decrease your effectiveness. Now, if people or the network or group who are getting or are unduly benefiting from the program, or who have been put on a participant list, or communities have been targeted that appear to be unfair, Pradyush, can I thank you? Sorry, I'll start again. If the people, network, or grouping that is unduly benefiting from the program, who you feel the rest of the community feels is getting undue benefit, happens to overlap with conflict divisions, well, you've just exacerbated grievances. And if people are interested in examples, we're happy to give some examples for that. Where do we need to look in terms of analysis? Well, this is stakeholder analysis. Really understanding who are the stakeholders, what are their actors, their motivations, their power, both informal and formal, and their relationships to each other. And then taking this into account in terms of your programming decisions. It's hard to know which vendors with what the implications of picking different vendors, partners, communities are, if you're not aware of who they are vis-a-vis the other actors in the environment. That was a very abridged version, and I hope that still made sense. But I did want to make sure that we had the opportunity for people to ask more questions and to comment and to give their feedback. I will say, if you are interested in the actual fulsome version of the paper that we're writing to support this framework, we would love to send it to you when we get it finished. And there's been a link popped into the chat that you can click on and sign up, and then you'll automatically be sent the paper. I'm going to ask Pratyush to move to the next slide. And yeah, there we are. At this point, I'm going to suggest that we shift to questions. If Pradyush, you can turn off the slides, and I can ask Diana and Sekalani to return to them with their video on. And Diana, if you can flag, what questions should we go to?
So we have, and please type in and see if you want something to add, answer live. So one question from Nawaf Al-Fayez is, are the tools used at the global level, in our opinion, feasible and effective?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'm not 100% sure I know which tools you're meaning. If you're meaning our tools, are they feasible and effective? We are constantly working to make them more feasible. They do require upfront time and expertise to apply, but they are not PhD 3-year research studies as well. Sekalani or Diana, would you like to say anything to that?
Perhaps just simply to say that we started on this learning journey with you last year, and in the, I think, about 8 months that we've been working together, we've really, learned a lot. It was very practical and direct. It does require a little bit of, front loading and time, resource, just to be able to grasp the concepts, but also to do the deep diving. But it's very practical. It's the work that we do on a day-to-day basis, but it really requires a disciplined perspective and practice around what you're looking for, what are you asking, what are you doing.
Super. Diana?
I'm muted. I don't know if there are any hands up. So Barbara Schreiner asks, is there a methodology for the systems analysis that has been presented here? And it's always nice to have a simple question. The answer is yes. So we've been using the causal, it's a fairly common form of systems analysis that was developed at MIT, a causal loop diagrams that sort of look at systems dynamics. So we have some guidance on it, on using it sort of to analyze corruption. And there's a lot of sort of step-by-step guidance on how to actually generate the maps. And there are ones that are more sort of qualitative, like the ones that we worked with Seguedlanes and with Accountability Lab on. And there are ones that if you are really wanting to put in and sort of model something, they're ones that actually can generate models and you can put numbers in, but they're pretty well established and have been used in a lot of other fields.
Yeah, on our website, and we'll see if we can find it to drop it into the chat. We have, it's a couple of years old, but a methodology that we originally used when we were testing whether causal loop mapping was appropriate for corruption analysis. And that's on the corruption, justice, and legitimacy.org website. And if we can drop it in, we will. Diana, any other questions that you want to flag?
And I will, and so I'll give a link to the practitioners. There's a link to the material, and I'm happy to, I can't pull it up right now, but I'm happy to give some more guides, links to other guides that are just on the methodology.
Yeah. We also have other cases. We've both blogged about it and written up if you're looking for more examples of systems mapping applied to corruption. And again, those are on our website.
So I think Josephine Davies has her hand up.
So Pratush, can you please let Josephine ask her question? Josephine, if you can unmute yourself and ask a question. I'm wondering if we have a challenge with that.
Oh.
Yep, we heard.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Josephine Davis from Sierra Leone. I've been in the field for almost 20 years, working as a developmental practitioner. And from there, I was forced to start my own private, registered my own private company to get to the rural area, but which is still a problem as gender in the figure. But thank you very much for your explanatory. It is nice, but the question I want to ask, what you have already elaborated and explained is being put together from all scenarios. And now the thing here is, and we've been seeing all these things rapidly moving from decades, because I'm in the field for 20 years, and we've seen the challenges we've been facing with big organizations to government organizations, and controversial with we developmental organizations who doing it out of our own sympathy feelings to work. But now we've been trying to see how these type of things can be addressed, and it's been addressed several times, year after year, in every panel, in meetings from all the banks. So now, please, I want to really know how concrete do you think everything you've put together can be now implemented in the real setting?
Sekulani, do you want to
I want to know a little bit how all what you have now been, because all what you are saying is being said decades back and over of different meetings. How are you going to implement it to make the differences in the real settings?
Sure. Maybe I can just take a bite at that. You know, I think that the approach is not one that seeks to solve the problem. It's one to support our efforts to solving the problem. I think that one, you know, as you rightly put it, you find that a lot of the interventions do involve what seem to be all the right stakeholders, but nothing really moves forward. What the systems and based analysis approach enables us to do is to also ask in a very intentional way, why? what is happening inside of the system that is enabling or being a hindrance to the progress of the intervention that is required, that seems to have all the right players in place. Secondly, and then it enables us then to take the right response to it, or to bring in the measures that can start to shift the system along in the appropriate way. Because now we see how we've blown it up, we now see how it works, we now know how each area relates with one another. I think the other thing, as I've already said, relationships are central to this work. I cannot express how hard it is to do anything without key relationships in place between yourselves as the people who are offering the intervention and those people who are inside of the system, who are working with it, in it, obstructing it, enabling it, right? And that again brings back the systems-based analysis approach to bear. When we want to find those key relationships and build them, it's key for us to know what are the operative dynamics around those key people are and what key relationships they own or have no access to influencing. And then in that way, we can then tweak, adjust, or frame our intervention to respond appropriately. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Sekulani. Thank you, Josephine, for the question. And we take your point. If it's not practical, then it's just chit chat and it doesn't really help anybody. And we're deeply committed to trying to simplify and make accessible work that is both useful, practical, and makes a difference to the people on the ground.
I just say too that it's no guarantee of success. I think and I think this is partly what Sekulani was pointing out, and because as we did our systems analysis and have the discussions together, I mean, I think Accountability Lab said, well, this thing we can't really touch because we can't do very much about. So it really, I think part of it is recognizing that there are some things over certainly in the short to medium term that we may not be able to affect, and kind of trying to figure out how we start doing that and where we can. But also, and I think a couple of the questions in the question and answer, really promoting a kind of a reflection on the external environment and the donors and how they are contributing in some of these processes, because some of these things can't happen, and we've been talking about them because the way that our processes for giving money, dispersing money, reporting on money, et cetera, have made it really difficult. So there are things on that end which also are difficult to change. So I think there's a recognition too that part of this will just help us think about where are some opportunities that we can start moving, shifting the system, I think, as Sekulani said.
Oh, thank you. But if you need me and whenever, please do feel free to contact me. I'm willing to be on the helping front.
Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody. This I think we could have probably done a 2-hour or 2.5-hour session, and we hope to do so in the future as the framework continues to be developed and we have more opportunity to work with folks to dive deeper to make it, as Josephine rightly pointed out, as practical and useful as possible. We would welcome your comments, your feedbacks. I've put Diana and my email in the chat, and Sekulani has also put his email in the chat. We would welcome feedback, suggestions, or just to meet you, because we're all feeling the effects of not getting to meet new people as often as we used to. Thank you very much for your time and your interest. We will be circulating the recording after this session, as well as for anyone who signed up for the paper, we'll be circulating that as well. And so with that, I thank you. I wish you a great weekend for those of you who are at the end of the day, and a good Friday for those of you who are just kicking it off. Thank you to Sekulani, Practitioner for operating so swiftly on the back end, and of course, Diana. All right.